Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving into the Ynnari. Finally, we're going to be talking about the most overpowered Eldari detachment in the lineup. So, the Eldari Codex has been out for a little bit now. People have gotten a good handle of it. We've played a lot of games with it as a community. We've seen what works, we've seen what doesn't work, and we've definitely seen a rise in the number of Eldari players in competitive play. And I think one of the main reasons for this is the Ynnari. Now, at the very beginning, not a lot of players were playing Ynnari. A lot of people were diving into Aspect Host because Aspect Host looked the best on paper. But in practice, it suffered from a lot of the things that Eldari lists suffer from, which is scoring primary and being able to, hold down objectives. And even though it was able to kill a lot of stuff, usually you were eventually trading down with it because it was so fragile. If you couldn't protect it, if you weren't smart about how you protected your models, they were going to just die horrible deaths. So, in come the Ynnari, a detachment that you would think wouldn't be that good at primary because it's just as squishy as the other detachments, but because of the rules of the detachment, they actually become one of the best. And when you supplement this with the different units, with their own abilities, and you build an army around this concept, you start to see something that is very, very strong. And not only very strong, but meta-defining. People have to know how to play against this faction to have success at tournaments. It is going to be one of the staples of tournament play, high-level Eldari tournament play in the coming weeks, up until the next balanced data slate. Now, they didn't choose to touch it. They nerfed a lot of the units that the Ynnari were bringing, like fire dragons and stuff like that. But they, I don't think, hit the main units. I don't think they hit the main problems of the Ynnari. And we're going to dive into just how strong this detachment is and how to play it on the battlefield in case you were wanting to try your hand with the faction. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive right in. So in this video, we're going to be talking through the detachment ability, enhancements, and stratagems of the Ynnari, the devoted of unique detachment. We're going to be looking at the best units in the detachment and why, the general strategy, strengths, and weaknesses of that detachment, an example army list that I've been using in my own games, which I have had very much success with, but also acknowledging that it's probably not the quote-unquote optimal, most competitive list out there, but it is very strong and it is competitive, and a rundown of how to set up and use the army on Tabletop Simulator. So, what are the detachment rules? So, they have the Servants of the Whispering God. This is 3 rules in 1. The first one is you can include Ynnari units in your army, even though they don't have the Azerani faction keyword. This is just, you can include the Dark Eldar units that are available to you. Witches, warriors, incubi, things like that. As far as the incubi go, they are a very good unit, and I'll talk about them later. As far as some of the other Ynnari units go, they're not that great, but, you can definitely include them. They're not terrible. We have the Azerani units gaining the Ynnari keyword, of course, and you must have Yvraine or the Yncarne in your army as the warlord. So this is actually not as bad as it seems. A lot of people would think, oh, this is awful, right? You can't have epic heroes in your army, for one, right? It bans epic heroes from your list, but the Yncarne or the Yvraine also have to be in your army. Well, you want the Yncarne to be in your army. Yvraine is more of a, I think she's really good, but she's not totally necessary. I could see lists working without her. But the Yncarne is an absolute include, and it's a great warlord because if it can survive to, use secondaries or, kind of other stuff throughout the game. Well, let me rephrase that. It can score secondaries very easily, certain ones like sabotage and, stuff like that where you need to actually survive until the end of your opponent's turn. And it can also just teleport all over the battlefield and support the main strength of this detachment. So you definitely want the Yncarne in this detachment in your army. It's a very good include. So having your warlord be the Yncarne is not a terrible thing. Now, there's 3 parts to this rule. There's lethal intent. So after your opponent's shooting phase is done, at the very end of it, if one or more Ynnari units from your army were destroyed, You select one Ynnari unit from your army, excluding Titanic, so no Wraith Knights, but that unit can make a normal move. This is incredible. It's just a normal move. It is not, a 7-inch move. It's not a D6. It's just a normal move. This is incredibly powerful, and it's the main reason why this detachment is so good. It's also after your opponent's shooting phase is over, so they have nothing left to shoot at the unit that actually moves onto the objective. Now, not only is it just a normal move, but it also can be affected by battle focus tokens, because battle focus tokens activate pretty much whenever you make a normal move. So star engines and, swift is the wind, or whatever it's called, the swift movement maneuver, is going to be allowed to be used on this move, which is pretty insane. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many people are complaining about this detachment, is because you can kind of stack things. Vehicles can move extra fast with star engines. And basically, you can move with star engines. Normally, you can only use it once, but with this ability, you can actually use it twice in the same round, because battle focus tokens are limited to the phase. So you can't use it more than once per phase on the same unit, but that doesn't mean you can't use it in your opponent's shooting phase. So in your own turn, you can use star engines on, one of your Venoms, and then in your opponent's shooting phase at the very end with lethal intent, you can use it again on another unit. So that's very good. I think the main strength of this is being able to obviously put units on objectives, so then your opponent has to charge those units, but if those units have fights first, you won't necessarily be able to take those objectives away from your opponents. So it's a very strong ability, and it's the defining thing of the army. Now, the other two are pretty good as well, but they're not obviously as good. You have Lethal Surge, which allows you to, instead of using a fade back move, use a Lethal Surge move, which essentially means you roll d6 plus 1, and if you get into engagement range with an enemy unit, you can charge that unit, or you count as being engaged with them. So if you're using a fights first unit, this is fantastic, because this means you fight first and you'll be able to kill them. However, it's not something that is typically going to come into play. However, it has come into play for me a couple times over the past couple games, because basically what happens is, in these types of games, when you're running Ynnari, your opponent's going to be extremely focused on getting onto primary objectives, and once they're on those primary objectives, trying to control them and trying to prevent you from getting points, then your units are sometimes, shot at or something like that, and you can just move into combat range and kill them. So, there is that. Your opponent has to basically not shoot you for this to happen. Then we have Lethal Reprisal. At the start of the fight phase, if a unit is below starting strength in your army, at the end of the phase, the unit has, or until the end of the phase, that unit has fights first. So not only are you able to take a lot of fights first units in your list, things like Howling Banshees, but you're also able to give something fights first if it's below starting strength. So that's going to be really good on the Incarn. That's going to be really good on things like Wraith Lords, who can easily take damage and still survive. And it's going to be really good on things out of transports, because if your opponent blows up a transport and they manage to deal one mortal wound to you or something like that, or if your vehicle explodes, which is the luckiest thing that can happen, a bunch of your units are going to get access to fights first. So in my particular list that I'm running, I use a lot of units that have Deadly Demise 1. And Deadly Demise 1 is perfect, because it's just enough to make sure that this ability is procced without totally obliterating my unit. Okay, let's talk about the enhancements. So the first one is Gaze of Ynnead. The Farseer gets Eldritch Storm on his, Devastating Wounds on his Eldritch Storm. This isn't that great. It's decent with the Farseer's ability to change a dice into a 6 to wound. You can do this twice. You can do it when you Overwatch, and you can do it when you shoot normally. However, I have to say, I don't think it's that good for 15 points. I think the points are better spent elsewhere. Plus, I don't think a Farseer is a good model to include in a Ynnari list. So that's just my personal take on it. I wouldn't take a Farseer if I was running Guardian Defenders. I just wouldn't take a Farseer in my unit. If I was running Storm Guardians, I would probably want to just take a Warlock instead. I think that'd be a little bit better value, but I just don't think the Farseer is that good with this detachment. ability. That's just my personal take on it. However, devastating wounds is very good, and if you can, get devastating wounds and roll that 3 on damage, it can be pretty nice. Okay, the next one is Storm of Whispers. It's on a Warlock only. Basically, after you shoot at that model, they make a battle shock test. This sucks. The reason why is because it's in the shooting phase and not in the command step before people make and score objectives. So if this was different, if this was like, if you shoot something, they're terrified, and when their command step comes around, they make a battle shock test, and if they fail it, they're OC 0, that would be good. But unfortunately, it's during the shooting phase, and it's just not really that great. So because of that, this one is going to go to waste. I don't like this enhancement at all. Then we have Borrowed Vigor. It's only 10 points. Gives the Archon 2 attacks, which is fine. I think the Archon is just okay in this detachment. I personally prefer the Visarch, because the Visarch gets, a greater variety of attacks that he can have, and he's not just good against infantry, he's good against a lot of different targets. But if you're running an Archon, you definitely want to bring this enhancement for the extra 10 points, because it makes the Archon hit harder. Then we have Morbid Might for a Succubus. Allows her to reroll wound rolls. And she's wounding on 3+ normally with anti-infantry. Again, I think this is just okay. It's not great. You're probably going to reroll 2 of them. Maybe you pick up 1 or 2 more wounds. But the problem is the Succubus is only 45 points. She's not that good, basically, is what I'm saying. She's not that great of a combatant. So her rerolls wounds is like, that would be really good on something like a Phoenix Lord, but it's not so great on something like a Succubus. It'd even be better on the Archon, because the Archon just has better attacks, in my opinion, has damage 2 on his weapon, and is just hitting way harder. The Succubus doesn't hit as hard, so therefore not really as good in my honest opinion. Okay, let's talk about these stratagems. So the first stratagem is Pall of Dread. Pall of Dread, it's in any phase. When a Ynnari unit is destroyed within range of 1 or more objective markers, you can use the stratagem on that unit. And you basically select one of those objective markers. So it does work if you spread a unit out over 2 objectives and your opponent destroys that unit, which, Rangers can do on Infiltrate turn. Then either one of those objectives can be stickied. So it's not both, it's just one, but then you can put sticky objectives on one of the, center no man's land objective markers. And that's really powerful. So it's only 1 CP. To be able to sticky an objective that your opponent shoots a unit off of is extremely powerful, because it doesn't just affect it in your command phase. It's not like normal sticky where you have to survive a full turn. This is your unit dies, you get to sticky it. Very strong, especially in an army that is going to be predicated. Its success is going to be basically measured on whether it can control primary or not. The next one is Macabre Resilience. You select 1 Ynnari infantry or mounted unit. It can't be a Wraith construct. It's in the shooting or fight phase, which is good. And it's just -1 to wound. It's just simply -1 to wound. So normally, you probably want your units to die, but if you have like a big unit of Guardians or something like that, big unit of Storm Guardians, you want to sticky an objective, make sure that that unit survives. You can use this, -1 to wound, and that is a pretty good buff. And of course, you can take a Warlock Conclave to add to them to give them the -1 to wound, but just being able to, for 1 CP, say that's -1 to wound means you don't necessarily have to take the Conclave with those Storm Guardians. So you can keep them cheap, you can keep them expendable, and you can still give them the durability that they need to survive at least 1 round of shooting in the early game. Okay, then we have Emissaries of Ynnead. So this one is interesting. I think sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. It's in the fight phase, just after you select targets with the Ynnari infantry unit. Until the end of the phase, you can reroll hit rolls of 1. If your unit's below starting strength, you can reroll the hit roll instead. Now, what this is really good on, guys, is Howling Banshees, because Howling Banshees are on 2s. So with Howling Banshees, you're just rerolling the hit roll no matter what. You don't have to worry about being below starting strength. This is decent on units that are a little bit bigger as well, that are going to be, damaged and stuff like that, but it is only infantry. It's not going to be able to target Wraith Lords. It's not going to be able to target, the Yin Karn and stuff like that. So unfortunately, you can't use it on those units. but it is really good on Howling Banshees. So being able to charge in with Howling Banshees and have them essentially hit just as hard as Aspect Warrior Howling Banshees is really good, especially in a detachment that has different bonuses available to you. Parting of the Veil is your Fight on Death stratagem, and this is really good because it's automatic Fight on Death. So if your Ynnead dies to something, you get an automatic Fight on Death. If your Howling Banshees, charge into something that has fights first, you can, for 2 CP, automatically Fight on Death. I think this is a really good counter, believe it or not, to units who have fights first that you charge. So let's say that I have a unit of Howling Banshees, and my opponent has something positioned near an objective that has fights first. I really need to get rid of that model to be able to execute my game plan of being able to control all the primary objectives that I can. Well, if I have the CP for it, which you should be able to, manage, you can charge a unit of Howling Banshees into that fights first unit. And then that fights first unit will kill your Howling Banshees. And in return, for 2 CP, you can still attack that model. So you can still make sure their Howling Banshees can cut through whatever that fights first model has. Against other Eldar players, if you're going against something like Howling Banshees in return that are doing the same thing to you, you can use this stratagem to kill their unit anyway. So it is kind of an even trade. I know it doesn't seem like it's worth it, but in a lot of cases, if you really need those units to die and they kind of are putting a wrench in your game plan, then you can always spend the resources to get rid of those threats. But yeah, other than that, just 2 CP to Fight on Death is really good if you don't have the opportunity to actually use your attacks, right? So if something strikes you first, kills you, and then, you're a pretty good melee-oriented unit, then you can Fight on Death, which is pretty good. We also have Soul Sight, which is a shooting stratagem for your shooting phase. You select one Ynnari unit from your army. Keep in mind, it's any Ynnari unit, so basically any unit from your army is going to gain lethal hits and ignores cover. So your Wraith Lords can get lethal hits, which may not seem like that big of a deal, but, Bright Lances having lethal hits, and sometimes if the game is really close and you're trying to just eke out a couple more wounds on a tough target, that could be worth it if you have the extra CP. Lethal hits on things like Dire Avengers are really good. Lethal hits on things like Wind Riders are really good. I think there's a couple of different builds that have, a powerful shooting unit for this stratagem. Personally, what do I think about this stratagem? I think it's a nice extra. I don't think it really does anything for what the list wants to do in general, right? But it is nice to have, right? If you have Fire Dragons and you're going against something very tough, even with the rerolls to wound, you're not guaranteed good damage, then you could use this and maybe also proc the aspect token from the Fire Dragons and make sure you get an automatic wound that also ignores cover. Fire Dragons being able to ignore cover means things like Land Raiders and, 2+ armor save units aren't going to get a great save against you anyway. They're just going to be saving on 6s instead of 5s, which is a big deal. So, yeah, I think it's a nice to have. I don't think it's a necessity for the army to work, but it's one of those things that will come up maybe once or twice a game. And then we have Death Answers Death. So Death Answers Death happens at the end of your opponent's shooting phase, around the same time that you make a lethal intent move. One Ynnari unit from your army. It can't be a Wraith construct, though, and you can only select it if one or more models in the unit were destroyed at this phase. So basically, generally it's going to be either mounted units or infantry units. And your unit can shoot as if it were the shooting phase. So this is best used on things like, Fire Dragons or something like that. Maybe a unit of Fire Dragons was affected by the deadly demise of a nearby Wraith Lord. And because it was affected by the deadly demise of a nearby Wraith Lord, you can move the unit out with lethal intent, and then you can use this stratagem on that unit to shoot. So basically what happens is the end of your opponent's shooting phase is when this effect would trigger, right? So you can choose to, use your lethal intent move first, and then you target that unit with this ability. So you move out that unit of Fire Dragons. And again, this isn't going to happen all the time. This is a very situational stratagem that's only good when something kind of goes out of plan or off plan, not according to what you have designed. But it can be very good if it happens, right? So it's like one of those weird things. So yeah, like if a nearby Wraith Lord dies, your opponent rolls a 6, it explodes, it kills a fire dragon, then basically what you could do is you could move the fire dragon unit out with lethal intent and then shoot with this stratagem. Really situational, probably won't happen that much, but it's there. I don't think a good opponent will let a unit that is out in the open survive the whole shooting phase and just allow it to shoot back with the stratagem. So, people who are like building their lists around this, like, oh, I'm going to have Wind Riders, like, I'm going to lose a model in my Wind Rider unit. I'm going to then, use my fade back ability and then I'm going to shoot, with this death answers death. And it's just like, I don't think your opponent just gives you that. I think if your opponent's only going to realistically kill like one model in the unit, they're just not going to shoot it, right? Like I would never shoot something that I'm only going to kill one model in. If I knew my opponent had access to something like this, I just wouldn't do it. So I think it is one of those very situational things that you're probably not going to use that much. I think the best use of it is just what I said. Situationally, if something blows up and kills a unit like a fire dragon or a dark reaper nearby or whatever it is, or then you can obviously then target, you can use lethal intent, move it out, and then shoot. Okay, so let's talk about the best units in this detachment and why. So the Ynnead has massive movement potential between the detachment rules and the ability to teleport to a nearby destroyed Eldar unit. The Ynnead is going to be key to making this army work and score primary objectives. He's a big threat on the battlefield, and he's something that does need to be taken seriously, even if he's a lot more fragile than before. And again, you're not going to use him as a, kind of an alpha strike kind of guy that's going to go into your enemy's backfield and wreak havoc. He's not going to be able to do that anymore. He's going to be more of a unit that is focused more on, controlling your own primary, staying safe, being a countercharge unit, things like that. But he is very good and he is very fast, and it gives your opponent a lot to think about as well. So, by the way, little, FYI out there, the Ynnead is still available. It's not that expensive on eBay and Amazon and stuff like that. So pick them up while he's cheap. All right, so Howling Banshees, they're an obvious choice. They have fights first. They have a stratagem that almost works perfectly with them to reroll ones to hit. They have a huge threat range with advance and charge, and it becomes even more insane with the detachment rules. I think you can also use an Autarch with the unit as well to give it a free stratagem and a reroll on their advance roll to make the unit just extra good. I don't have an Autarch in my own army, but that's just simply because I wanted more Howling Banshees. Corsair Void Reavers are perfect for this detachment. They are cheap scouting units with solid melee against units on objectives, who then obviously want to die, a glorious death for the Eldari cause, for the Ynnari cause, and then proc the detachment rule as a result. So these guys are really good. They have grenades, they scout, they have battle lines, so they're, going to be putting down flags and stuff like that for you. They're going to be scoring you points left and right. And then on top of it all, they have some decent combat and shooting potential as well. And they have battle focus, so they can do all the normal stuff that, other Eldar units can do. So they're no longer locked out of that ability. So yeah, Corsair Void Reavers, guys, really good. Absolute goats in this detachment. I wouldn't run a Ynnari list without at least 2 of these. Rangers are really good as well. You definitely want at least 1 Ranger unit in your army to infiltrate up the board and put early pressure on your enemy army, because your enemy has to deal with them or else you're going to score primary points, and their built-in reactive move helps them to counter the Ynnari's main weaknesses of fast, aggressive melee armies. And on top of that, what I talked with, about earlier with Pall of Dread, allowing them to die on an objective and make that objective sticky is really good as well. Incubi are also a great choice because they hit extremely hard for the cheap cost and are pretty good with the Visarch, who then has fights first and can, after they kill a unit, if they consolidate into another unit, they take the hits, which is okay in this detachment because you get fights first if you do. So it's okay to, go into another unit. And then I guess these guys already have fights first, but they can get access to reroll all hits, which is really good. via their, stratagems. And then, they can kind of go from there, and they can do some really, really strong things in your opponent's backfield if they manage to get there. And then Yvraine, with her rerolls to wound, is a great counterpuncher, so she does a ton of damage with her units against infantry. You charge this girl into a unit of, Terminators or something really strong that has dev wounds, or not dev wounds, sorry, just a really good invul save, and she can do dev wounds with her shooting attack. And then when she charges in, she's rerolling wounds, so that includes her own, and she does have devastating wounds on her weapon in combat as well. Wraithlords and Wraithblades are tough units that greatly benefit from the potential fights first of the detachment rule as well when they're damaged, and they gain the additional movement from Lethal Intent, which is really good for Wraiths because Wraiths are slow, and this makes up for it. They're also extremely survivable on primary objectives and can function at below starting strength for stratagem synergy. Again, like I said, this is really good on, units that typically have a harder time functioning on the battlefield in another detachment. But because they get that extra speed, they get a little bit of extra, combat ability with fights first, they're a much better unit. Autarchs also hit reasonably hard. So, if you want to put an Autarch with a unit of Howling Banshees, that's also a pretty good choice. They kind of allow you to, be a little bit more CP efficient. So Banshees can get a free reroll once to hit with the Autarch. And they are effective in combat against a variety of units. Because they have damage 3 when you have an Autarch and a Howling Banshee with an Executioner, so the Exarch essentially, that can actually be a really good unit against Terminators now because you have a bunch of damage 3 in the unit. So Autarchs really do boost what the Howling Banshees can potentially hit hard. And I think one of the changes that I would possibly make to my list is actually axing the Visarch and putting in an Autarch. But that's, anyway, that's neither here nor there. I'm just thinking for the future. Both are really good, though, I have to say. Then, lastly, Scatter Laser Windriders, Dire Avengers, or Kabalite Warriors love having access to easy lethal hits with the stratagem and ignores cover with their shooting. Makes them really effective at shooting. I don't really like the cost of Dire Avengers. The Windriders are really good with their rerolls, though, and I will say Scatter Laser Windriders are probably the best shooting option for this detachment because they're getting sustained hits, they're getting lethal hits, and then they're getting rerolled all hits against the closest eligible target. So they just do a ton of wounds to your opponent, just force a ton of saves, which is good in almost any situation. And then, of course, ignoring cover means that opponents that are, more lightly armored, maybe a 4-up save, aren't going to be getting a better save against them. So I really do like that unit a whole lot. All right, let's talk about the general strategy, strengths, and weaknesses of the detachment. So here's the general strategy. Control primary objectives through a variety of different methods, including moving your units onto objectives via lethal intent at the end of your opponent's shooting, or the Incarn's, teleporting ability, making objectives sticky when your units die on objectives so your opponent can't really deal with them, right? So if your opponent accidentally shoots too many units off an objective and it's like, oh, I meant to leave one alive, but because I rolled a little bit hot, I didn't. Because you're Eldar, you're going to die really quick. Oh, I'll just make the objective sticky. You're not on the objective. You have nothing to charge the objective, so I control it. And lastly, utilizing fights first units to protect your primary in the fight phase. So in case your opponent doesn't kill the full unit, charges your unit onto the objective, then you can use units like Howling Banshees to just heroically intervene, kill the opposing unit, and out-primary your opponent anyway. So essentially, you're putting your opponent in a position where they can't shoot you, they can't assault you, and they can't ignore you. So, win-win-win. Now, I think the army has 3 things that you really need in it for it to work. It's divided up and plays into 3 parts or phases, I would call. And this is basically the different phases of the game to ensure that you score the maximum amount of points and that your army functions efficiently. This is a kind of a harder army to actually operate and run. So the first phase is going to be your skirmishing phase. Your expendable skirmishers are going to proc lethal intent and set up your primary game for the remainder of the mid game. So this is, turns 1 and turns 2. Turns 3 and turns 4, but probably mostly in turns 3. You're going to be moving heavy damage dealers and tough units onto primary objectives to stage and hold, and you're going to be counterattacking against whatever your opponent sent against your skirmishers. And when I do the video on Tabletop Simulator, I'll show you guys how you can do that, and also how you can get your skirmishers to be able to deal with enemy battle line units. So units like Corsairs are really perfect against battle line units like Space Marines because they reroll their hit rolls on objectives and stuff like that. So they actually have really good value for 60 points versus something like a unit of 5 intercessors. And then lastly, to secure your positions, you want to move up fights first units, usually out of line of sight, but behind things like Wraith Lords and the Yncarn and stuff like that on objectives, so your opponent cannot melee you on objectives and that you can heroically intervene where needed. And this is very important because opponents, especially Space Marine opponents, will notice that your list is, going to be very strong against shooting, and they will turn off their shooting in certain situations and they will just charge you. And Space Marines, being a generalist army, are good in assault. I mean, each of them gets like 3 attacks at strength 4. I think they have AP -1 on their attacks, so it's nothing to laugh at. Eldar units that are charged by Space Marine units can and do often just die, right? So to get around this, you put Howling Banshees nearby, they heroically intervene, Space Marines can't do anything about it, they die in return. Okay, so what are the strengths of this detachment? So it is the fastest detachment in the fastest army in the game. It is unequivocally the fastest. The units move super quick, and on top of that, you're getting extra moves also. So, you can technically move a unit from one side of the board to the complete opposite side of the board in a single round, which is no other army in the game can do that, right? No other army in the game, aside from maybe Thousand Suns with Magnus, can move a unit from your board edge to the opponent's board edge. That's pretty insane. Or your deployment zone to the enemy deployment zone. That's absolutely bonkers. But you can do this with this detachment with star engines on some vehicles and stuff, and it's just absolutely insane. So it is very fast. It has massive access to fights first and fight on death to counter the detachment's only real weakness. So the detachment's weakness is combat. Fast-moving combat armies. With a bunch of fights first and, the proper list building and stuff like that, and fight on death, those armies are not a super hard counter. They're strong against Ynnari, but they're not super strong. You have tools to deal with it. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, it has insane primary control, and it counters shooting armies hard. So half the armies in the game are wanting to shoot you, if not more. I think actually, I'd probably say about 75% of the armies in the game love to shoot at you with at least part of their army, and it's really good against those types of armies. It really does counter them a lot because you can sticky your objectives. If your opponent doesn't fully kill you on the objective, then you control primary, and if your opponent does kill you, then you get sticky objectives, right? Yeah, it just goes on and on and on. Like, your opponent can't really do a lot against you if they're just shooting you off objectives. However, the detachment does have a couple weaknesses. So fast, aggressive armies who can establish board control before you do, and also kill a lot of your initial units, can really upset this detachment. Again, the counter to this for you, though, as the Ynnari player, is you have to screen and position your units correctly and make sure you know your enemy's threat ranges so that you don't get caught off guard. If you do that, that's no problem. Fast, aggressive armies will be screened out. They won't be able to really interact with you in a way that they want to interact with you. And after the first few turns is over and you've established your own game plan, they're not going to be able to do much against it because you have a ton of fights first, you have a ton of counters to their melee threats. But, fast, aggressive armies can throw you off guard and can beat you down very quickly. Fast, aggressive armies, if they get a hold of you, they will win within the first couple turns of the game. And if you can survive and, mitigate their damage during the first couple turns and also score some primary while you're at it, chances are you have them beat. The last weakness is probably that they have less raw damage output than other Eldar detachments. So if you're looking at Aspect Host, if you're looking at Seer Council, in general, they have less raw damage output. not Seer Council in particular, but things like Aspect Host and War Host, are going to be, usually including units that are going to be doing more damage, right? But that's okay because we have enough damage to deal with the threats that we need to deal with. And this detachment's main thing is controlling primary. Okay, so here is the army list that I came up with and have been running over the past, few games. I've played actually 2,000 point games with this army. I've played a little bit of a, kind of 2 or 3 1,000 point games with Ynnari, and with kind of the same idea, but obviously less points, which is not that competitive. But this army actually, okay, so just to let you guys know, I played against two different opponents, a Blood Angels player who I play against frequently, and this army dismantled his list very quickly, and also my Ultramarines friend. And my Ultramarines friend, not super competitive, but he's good. He's a good player. He plays a lot of games. He knows how to score the objectives and stuff like that. The only reason I say he's probably not as competitive is because he's not running, carbon copies of the winning Ultramarines lists and tournaments. He kind of has his own homebrew list. He uses things like Eradicators, the Melta guys. He uses several units of those because he really likes them, and he's learned to use them well over the years. But they're probably not the most competitive unit, right? And he's been known to bring a unit of suppressors, the autocannon flying guys, in a few games, and I don't think they're that good, but they seem to be pretty good against Eldar, but, stuff like that. So anyway, the point is that when I played against him, he had a really hard time dealing with the army as well, because a lot of his stuff just likes to shoot. He does have assault units, but he has a lot of shooting units in his army, and his army is, pretty much 60% or at least 70% shooting, 30% combat. So he had a tough time as well. So this is the list. We have the Visarch, the Yncarne, and Yvraine. All three. We have the trifecta, the triumvirate right here. The Visarch and Yvraine probably aren't auto includes, but I do find them very effective. They are good. If I wanted to replace them with anything, I would just replace them with two Autarchs in my Howling Banshee squads, but I haven't found the need to do that yet. We do have the Yncarne, and again, like I said, the Yncarne is pretty much an auto-include for reasons I'll go into in the Tabletop Simulator example in just a second, but yeah, very fast, good at controlling objectives, big monster that can heroically intervene and just totally wipe out enemy units. And then if your enemy unit does damage him a little bit, he can just heal it and have fights first for the rest of the game because he doesn't have to heal the full amount, right? So he could just be basically at 19, no, sorry, he could just be at, I think it's 11 wounds. I think he has 12 wounds total or 14 wounds total. He could just be at, 13 wounds or 11 wounds and just basically survive the entire game, right? With fights first. For battle line, we have 3 units of Corsair Void Reavers. We have 1 blaster in each squad. We have, the Neurodisruptor, the Mist Shield, all the normal stuff. Neurodisruptors are better. Power swords are the way to go with these guys because they're going to be wanting to engage enemy units in melee combat. So you're going to be wanting those power swords. And the blaster is just good anti-marine in general. It auto-kills marines on a 2-up, essentially. So it's a good weapon for dueling in the early game. As for the other data sheets, we have 2 units of Fire Dragons. And Fire Dragons are going to be our unit that's going to take out our big threats, our monsters, stuff that the rest of our army can't really deal with. Vehicles, things of that nature. Fire Dragons are really good against those targets. We're going to have some Howling Banshees. Those are going to be our fights first units, and they're going to be taking care of infantry threats that encroach on our objectives. We're going to have 3 Wraith Lords. They're going to be for primary support, and they're also going to just be big beat sticks that can just deal with monsters, vehicles, infantry, kind of just well-rounded units that can deal a lot of damage to a variety of targets and be tough on objectives. We're going to have 2 units of Incubi. They're going to be in Venoms. They're going to be, a unit that's going to, with Yvraine and the Visarch, hopefully get out, hit something hard, then get back in the Venom, and just kind of reactivate multiple times in a game to make sure that we have more resources than our opponent at the end of it. We have a unit of 5 Rangers for early game sticky objectives and screening and, to prevent scouting moves and infiltration moves and stuff like that. We have a Warlock Skyrunner to kind of run around with the Wraith units and give them +1 to hit, and generally just to do secondaries and stuff. Really good model for that. We have a unit of 5 Wraith Blades, which are going to be another tough, you know, ghost sword wielding badass unit that can fight on death on a 3+ because of their ability, and, just basically be on a primary objective and also just control primary, right? So that's also really strong. We have 2 Venoms as well that are going to be with the Incubi. So that's the list. So let's now go to Tabletop Simulator and let's go ahead and go through how this list is deployed and generally how you want to run it on the battlefield. Alrighty, guys, this is the army in its fullest. Now, it doesn't look very large, but we do have a lot of big threats in this army. And this army basically operates on the premise of controlling objectives, being really tough to deal with, and being very deadly. We have a lot of units that can go very far into the enemy's deployment. Even on the first turn, if our opponent makes a mistake and kills something they shouldn't have, we can send Banshees, we can send Venoms deep into the enemy deployment zone to kill key units that they will need to strike back efficiently at things like Wraith Lords and the Incarn. So the idea of the early game is going to be we're going to rely on the gunners, or no, sorry, not the gunners, the Kamalite, sorry, this is the blaster gunner. We're going to rely on Corsair Void Reavers to kind of skirmish over objectives, die, proc the lethal intent, which will give us our free movements, and Rangers to do this as well. And we will follow up with Wraith Blades. These don't have the axes and shields, they actually do have the swords. So it's just that Tabletop Simulator doesn't have the swords, so we're just going to have to go with the axes for this example. But yes, this unit is going to then control objectives pretty well. They have fights on death. I actually very much like the Wraith Blades in this particular detachment because they get the move from lethal intent. And they also get some other cool things from the Ynnari that are just not available for other detachments. So we have our Wraith Blades, and they're pretty good at, kind of surviving on an objective. We have our Howling Banshees as well. Their fights first are they're absolutely beautiful. We have our Vizark and Yvraine, which are both going to be in Incubi squads. And essentially the reason why this is we're just trying to get these Incubi to hit harder against the targets they need to get to. So reroll wounds plus Yvraine's damage. The Vizark with his fights first and his, better damage. He does better damage than an Archon in my opinion. I think the Vizark is the better choice over an Archon with the, I don't know what the enhancement is called off the top of my head when I'm doing this example, but it's like Borrowed Vigor. That's what it is, Borrowed Vigor. I think the Vizark is just straight up better than the Archon in a lot of situations. And if your opponent's not careful, the Vizark can take out something like, Marneus Calgar, for example. If your opponent's running Marneus or something in the backfield, this guy can just assassinate him very quickly. And, Marneus is basically relying on a 4+ invul save to save him, and that can be very scary. So your opponent is going to probably try his best to screen this unit out. So that gives us a huge advantage in the center. If Marneus and friends aren't, in a position to support their allies in the center of the battlefield, then we're going to have a lot of, we're going to have a way easier time, essentially. We do have 3 Wraith Lords. They are good at primary objectives. They do go down fairly quickly if they're just out in the open sitting there, but that's okay. Remember, we can afford to throw away Wraith Lords in this list because we're just going to follow up with something and hit your opponent even harder. So this is the army. Well, of course, a single Warlock Skyrunner just to kind of give the Wraith Lords, and Wraith Guard some, coverage, and it's also a decent secondary objective score. So this is a sweeping engagement deployment. I think it's terrain layout number 6, I want to say, or yeah, I think it's number 6 or number 5. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that, but we essentially have this set up here. Now, this is pretty much how you want to set up the army. You want to set up the army to respond to each of the objectives. So one thing that I think is common in Eldar armies is they kind of concentrate their forces. You concentrate on these 3 objectives right here. Well, in this particular army, you want to be able to take as many primary as you can because you want to spread your opponent as thin as possible. The reason this is because once they start killing your units, you can respond in turn with one of your own very quickly. It's not going to take you any kind of time at all. So, first turn, there's one trick that I kind of want to show you guys that I think is absolutely vital to playing this army. Now, we see here, normally you wouldn't put rangers on objectives, right? Because it could technically give your opponent overwhelming force. They could get, you know, some secondary points on that first turn. But I have found that putting a single ranger on this one objective is actually a pretty good move because we have the stratagem Pall of Dread. So remember from earlier in my video, Pall of Dread just basically gives the objective sticky if your opponent destroys a unit on it. So this unit is currently controlling this objective. We have screened out any scout moves or anything like that. So our opponent's not really going to easily be able to get on this objective. You know, your opponent's probably not going to just run 5 models here because there's a threat that they will die if they don't get first turn. So they're going to be behind cover and from cover, right? 6 inches with an advance roll. It does get them on this objective, but barely, right? They have to get a pretty good advance roll to get on the objective. And then that brings them within 9 inches of this unit, which this unit can then, you know, pile on the objective themselves and get some decent OC on it. And if your opponent actually kills this unit, then of course the unit can just proc lethal intent. You can move something else up and counterattack. The other thing is your opponent, because this unit is in between 2 objectives, if your opponent's moving a lot of stuff here, that's just going to basically eliminate the chances of you being able to activate Pall of Dread to make this objective sticky, then you just go over to this objective, right? And you basically do the same thing here. And what this does, essentially, is this baits your opponent, this forces your opponent, I should say, to put models on 2 objectives, turn 1. In their first turn, they will have to, or else, you know, you'll score primary points, which is going to be the main game of this detachment. They will have to put bodies on these 2 objectives, and you have only spent 55 points of rangers being able to do that. And if they do die, it's okay because that procs lethal intent. You can move up any other units. Now, the second wave is going to be our Corsairs. They're going to be our duelists. They're going to duel with these kind of units here. You know, things like Intercessors, things like, you know, Chaos Space Marines, stuff like that. These are Chaos Space Marines. These are Warp Talons back here. But you can kind of see these could easily be Jump Pack Intercessors over here. These could be Assault Intercessors up here, just waiting for their chance to get up there on objectives. A lot more people are running the Intercessor squads because they're really good at killing infantry. Eldar is, you know, kind of in ascendance right now, Eldari, so a lot of people are, in my experience, putting, you know, 1 or 2 squads of Intercessors in their list because they trade really well with Eldar units. Well, guess what? That's going to work to our advantage because they're going to want to make this objective sticky too. They're going to want to get on this objective because Intercessors also have the sticky ability. So we kind of bait these 2 units into these objectives, and that is 160 points that we can clean up fairly easily. And how we do that is these guys can scout up. They can scout up right to here, right? And then they can then lethal intent. Right, so after they're done scouting, which is going to be probably right about here, they can lethal intent onto the objective. They do have the ability to also use battle focus for another 2 inches, so 9 inches. And when I say that Corsairs are good now, it's because they have battle focus, right? We can get on this objective. We can get 10 OC on this objective. Even if they advance roll like a 4, they're only going 10 inches from the closest. Let's see if the back guy can get 10 inches on the objective. Not quite. See that? So they'd have to roll a 5 to get more than 10 OC, you know, to equal your OC on the objective. Now, they could, of course, charge you, right? That is a possibility. But again, if they do that, their unit is going to be vulnerable, and you have, you know, kind of sacrificed the 60-point unit to kill an 80-point unit. So you're trading up. So you're making it very hard for your opponent to actually do things. You can also move this Wraithblade unit, right? And this is why we have the Wraithblade unit kind of up here in the center, because we can go after either objective. If your opponent attacks this objective, we can move to engage. If your opponent attacks this objective, which is probably the better one for us because it's out kind of to the side, has some cover. We can, lethal intent up 6 inches. They don't get battle focus, but then during your own turn, you can move another 6 inches, right? Which brings you right up to the objective. You can charge in and you can take the objective from your opponent. And then you have a really hard unit on the objective that your opponent cannot deal with effectively, right? Your opponent's going to have to swing out a bunch of units this way to be able to effectively kill them. And there's some cheeky shenanigans you can do with this layout, that kind of make it a little bit hard for your opponent to do that. Now, that's the initial assault, right? We can trade with these Corsair units. They don't exactly kill 5 Marines, but they kill probably about 3 of them, maybe 4 if you're lucky. And that's on, that's if they're on objectives. Corsair Void Reavers do get bonuses when your opponent's on an objective. So, all this is kind of planned out. As you guys can see, the army list is designed for maximum damage, and it's designed to first bait your opponents out on these objectives, because if they don't, you're going to sticky them or you're going to capture them or whatever it is. And then afterward, just hit them hard and fast. Now, we do have fire dragons here. Fire dragons on foot. I know that may seem really weird, and most people are like, why don't you take a wave serpent with them? They'll move faster, it's more durable. The thing about fire dragons is we can always use the +2 movement and the advance roll because they all have assault. So if we advance, say 3 inches on average, right, we can go 7 plus 3, which is 10, plus 2, which is 12, and we can get right about there. From this position, right, as you can see, we're in between the sweet spot of where enemy vehicles like to go. So when enemy vehicles are wanting to attack, they're going to be right here. They're going to be right here, right? So our fire dragons can easily deal with those threats, right? I mean, even if your opponent puts a vehicle here, it's going to be also just in easy melter range from pretty much all your models, right? So that's not a good position for your opponent to be against fire dragons. Same thing over here, right? If your opponent brings like something big into the middle, you can easily just dispatch it pretty quick. Now on this side, we have kind of the same thing. We have a couple, melee threats. We have banshees. We have a unit of incubi, probably going to be with Yvrane, or perhaps even the, depends where your opponent's units are, to be honest with you. But, Visarch could be in there as well. We have a unit of Corsairs. And again, their job is just to get to this objective with their scout move. Right? So we tow the objective. We force our opponent to react to it. Our opponent now has to kill this unit. Now, with battle focus, there's a lot of cool things we can do when our opponent shoots this unit. If they kill the unit, we can sticky it. If they don't kill the unit, and, they're probably not going to kill the unit, we can use our battle focus to do this. So I'll show you guys really quick. So we have 7 inches here, right? This is their scout move. They get up 7 inches. Typically speaking, probably only want to put 1 model on there, but that's our 7 inches, right? And then our opponent shoots us. Let's say they knock down 2 of these models. And then what we can do is we can roll a dice to see how far they move with opportunity seized. Or not opportunity seized, excuse me, fade away. And then we could just move D6, maybe we get a 4-inch move, right? So now, look at that. I don't think our opponent can target us anymore, right? It's going to be harder for our opponents to target us, and we're going to just capture the objective. So there's a lot of cool things we can do with these little, units of Corsairs. In the first couple turns, you should only be concentrating on moving and being able to use these Corsairs to their maximum effectiveness. That's the goal. Use them to control objectives early game. It will force your opponent to engage you in a more serious way, and then you can bring in your more serious hitters, like Howling Banshees, Incubi, right? The Ynnari. By the way, the cool thing about the Ynnari, guys, what I just mentioned about those Corsairs, is that if they end up killing the Corsairs here, right? If they indirect fire them, like, something an opponent might do that thinks they're clever is they might shoot them. They might move over here, and then they might bomb them with indirect fire. Let's say you're going against guard. and they know you're going to move behind line of sight. So they hit you with some last guns or whatever. Maybe they hit you with a unit of combat engineers. You lose several models. You move like, one or two or whatever's left in your unit. You move like 2 or 3 models back here. And then they hit you with some mortars. Which, by the way, even at I think they're like 65 points now or 75 points for squad mortars. I think people are still going to take mortars. Mortars are good. Mortars are good into Eldar, and they're still cost effective for what you get. So basically what happens here is these guys are going to die. Mortars are probably going to be able to kill or pick up 3 Corsairs, right? So then what you do is you simply teleport the Incarn over there, right? It is turn 1. You don't really have to worry about your home objective on turn 1 typically. It's fine. Unless you go first, in which case you definitely want to move a Wraith Lord up here or something to cover it. But the Incarn just teleports over here. And the cool thing about this is the Incarn teleports to where you died, which is behind this wall. So you're safe. Typically speaking, you're safe. Now, most, and when I say most, most competitive formats will have opaque walls, so the Incarn can't be seen. It depends on your situation. Don't use this piece of advice and say, oh, Proxy Hammer, the Incarn's just going to die now. You just killed the Incarn. Because now my opponent has, has 3 Leman Russes over here, or has a Rogel Dorn right here ready to attack it. I definitely, okay, so that would be a bad idea to do, to teleport in there. In that case, all you have to do is sticky this objective, right? That's all you have to do. Pay the CP, sticky the objective, if you see something like a Rogel Dorn here. But if your opponent has a melee threat, a credible melee threat, then moving your Incarn here could be really good, because you could just basically have something to contest the objective against your opponent. Even if they charge the Incarn, it's not going to end well for them, right? So that's something else you could do. You want to keep in mind all of your options when using this army. What tool can I use to destroy this unit that is just taking the objective so I can reestablish the objective? And then if my opponent shoots me, I can sticky myself, right? I can sticky the objective. If my opponent gets into combat with me, they're not going to be able to do anything because I have Howling Banshees right here, right? The other thing is Howling Banshees. Maybe what you do instead is once you lose this unit, you teleport the Incarn, right? Immediately. And watch this. You teleport it onto the objective close to where they died. And then you use Lethal Intent to move your Howling Banshees up 8 inches. And then, guess what your opponents can't, guess what your opponent can't do? They can't charge you. Because you're just going to heroically intervene into their unit and fight first. Right? Now, the only counter that your opponent can do against this, and this is something everybody should be aware of, and this is how you play against Ynnari, is your opponent can simply advance onto the objective, turn 1, and sit there and not charge, and just put OC onto the objective. That's the only thing they can do. However, this is still a kind of a terrible strategy in a lot of ways. It's, well, not, let me put it this way. It's not terrible, but it also works to your advantage because they are throwing away a unit to deny you primary. But in denying you primary here, they're also, going to lose their models. So if you're able to, on turns 2 and 3, clean up most of your opponent's army, which you probably will if your opponent's really trying hard to, just put bodies on objectives to just force you to not be able to capture them. And you'll probably still be able to capture one of them at least because you'll be able to screen out your opponent on that side. But they're not scoring primary either. And on top of that, they don't have any units by turn 4. So on turns 4 and 5, you're scoring a bunch of primary points, and you will usually be able to overcome your opponent's score at that point. Secondary scoring is fairly easy with this list as well. You can use Wraith Lords for early secondary scoring. The reason I have this Wraith Lord over here is because I could just move up this Wraith Lord behind this ruin first, turn, this little ruins, and I can just do sabotage. right? Or not sabotage, excuse me. I can just do containment. I can do sabotage with, a unit of Corsairs here to the middle. I could even use these Wraith Blades to go behind here and do sabotage, right? I can use the Ynnead for sabotage. It's okay to use the Ynnead for sabotage, guys. He's tough. And if you can't be seen on the other side of walls or ruins, then it's a pretty good target to do that with. So secondary objective scoring isn't an issue with this army. I know we don't have, tons of secondary scoring units, but we have enough. We have a Warlock Skyrunner who can go and do, engage and can do different things like that, right? So Warlock Skyrunner can be very quick. He can get up here quickly and do engage. So you can score 3 points on that. You can score not only containment, but you can get to the middle very quickly. So if you need to score established locus and you don't want to waste a unit doing it, just use your Rangers that are already right here, right? Or use your Corsairs that are right here that can do it. That can score you some good points. And when you don't have an objective that's scoreable, discard it for a CP, because this detachment needs CP to operate as well. It's not as CP hungry as some of the other Eldari detachments, but to be fair, you could also discard objectives that you can't score on a given turn. So yeah, maybe you draw something like Marked for Death. That's a discard. If your opponent doesn't give you those units to kill, don't go super out of your way to kill one of those units. I know it's 5 points, but if you're losing your Ynnead and 2 units of Howling Banshees trying to kill something, trying to kill, Guilliman or something like that, and then he just gets back up, like, what's the point of that? Yeah, you scored Marked for Death because technically Guilliman died. By the way, guys, that's how it works for revive abilities. If Fuegan dies, he does count as destroyed. Your opponent will get assassinate for that. If you get up again and your opponent kills him again, then, they could technically score again. It's just assassinate, you only score once on it. You only get 5 points for it, right? So I think it was in previous editions that it worked that way. But yeah, if Guilliman dies, yeah, you'll get the 5 points for Marked for Death. But you're also trading Ynnead and 2 units of Howling Banshees, and that throws off your primary scoring game. And again, you're going against the kind of operating procedure of this detachment, right? That's more of an aspect host thing. Aspect host should be able to be built around the fact that you can go and kill units, and Marked for Death is a good one for aspect host because it's fast, it can get to places, and it can definitely kill stuff for, less investment than other detachments, because you have, Warrior's Focus and you have Preternatural Precision or whatever it is. So you can, definitely with 1 squad of Fire Dragons, 1 squad of Howling Banshees, clip a unit that is normally going to be pretty tough against you. Plus you get the rerolls in Aspect Host. Aspect Host is still good, it's still viable. It's just that people are a little bit doubtful of it now because it's more expensive. And Ynnari is obviously the detachment everyone's saying is going to be super OP, nerfed. I think it'll probably be nerfed as well, but I don't think the thing that's going to be nerfed is what people necessarily believe. I think people are kind of under the assumption that the Ynnari units are going to get nerfed, like the units used in Ynnari. I think what's going to happen is simply that the detachment ability is going to get nerfed. They might nerf a few other things, but it's not going to be focused towards Ynnari. It's going to be more of a general nerf, I think. So I think it'll be fine. It won't be that bad. Eldar are doing good right now. Eldar are eating well. Let's enjoy the next 3 months and just let it wash. Let it wash over you like a fresh spring rain. I was going to say something else, but it was a little inappropriate, so I won't say it. So anyway, this is how the army operates. So let's do a couple of examples here and just run through, something that you should be thinking about doing with your army. So let's take a unit of Corsairs, right? They use their scout move. They get up here. That's generally what you want to do. You want to scout up first turn because you want to be able to get into position to dominate objectives. Your opponent, on the other hand, sees that you move scouts up here and says, Chaos Space Marines, I'm going to move up. All right, and they move up 6 inches or whatever it is. Let me actually put the measurement tool on these guys. I forgot to do that. I don't usually care about measuring the example models, but here we go. So we move these guys up 6 inches. God, they're slow. Space Marines are so slow. Silly Monkai. So they move up to 6 inches, right? And they can't really get to you except to shoot these Rangers. That's it. So maybe they shoot the Rangers. Maybe they kill like 3 of them. And then your other 2 say, okay, that's fine. I'm just going to, put this guy on the objective as well. And maybe this squad moves up 6 inches or tries to advance on the objective to get some OC, and they, start out OCing you or whatever, right? So that's good, but again, they're not scoring on turn 1. So you have an easy kill now because you have a choice. You could either, and if they kill the rest of the Rangers, you could definitely do this, but whoops, I didn't mean to delete those, but okay. So you could either move units onto the objective, or you could just engage these Chaos Space Marines next turn. Most likely, if you're playing against someone who really knows the game and really wants to try to counter your Ynnari, they're going to assault, right? They're gonna move up and they're gonna advance. So squad of intercessors can advance and shoot. They have the assault on their weapons, and they're probably going to advance and shoot at the Rangers, and they're going to kill the Rangers with like 20 shots, right? So they kill the Rangers. You can't choose to just shoot like 3 models out of the unit. If you do shoot, you have to shoot everything. So the Rangers are dead, right? We established that we can't really sticky this objective. They advanced up, so we can't really sticky this objective, so we can't use that stratagem. We're going to have to do that on another objective, perhaps. But what we can do is they have advanced. They can't charge, and they're probably not going to get all their models on here, because if we put them back to their original position, right, 10 inches gets them right about here, and that's at the farthest model to the left, gets them right about here. They're probably not going to get all their units here. So we just use Lethal Intent. There we go. That's 10 OC on our objective. Now our turn comes along, and if we went first, we're going to now score this objective. If we went second, then what we get to do now is we get to kill this unit, because now it's out in the open. They have killed a 55-point unit of Rangers, but whatever. And then we get to kill this unit in return. We also have Howling Banshees here. But remember, Intercessors are more or less expensive than Banshees, so we don't want to just trade for that. We want to really make sure that our points are being efficiently used. This should be enough with the rerolls. Remember, you can also use a command point for lethal hits and ignores cover. It's not the best, but lethal hits and ignores cover with, no, never mind. Scratch what I said. Don't use the CP for that. That's awful. But you could, obviously shoot them. Blaster can kill something. They do have grenades. You can throw a grenade at them, and then you can charge them. That should kill them. And then you have control over the objective again, right? Or you don't even have to use the Corsairs if you don't want to. If you want to make a little bit of a bigger play because maybe your opponent doesn't have exactly what they need to kill 5 Wraithguard, you can move 5 Wraithguard or Wraithblades up 6 inches right here, right? Then during your turn, you move them up another 6 inches. Boom. And then you can charge them and then kill them. That's only if you're not going to score points on your turn. So if you go second, this is maybe what you want to do, because this is your first turn, right? This was their first turn. This is your first turn. You're not going to score objective points, so maybe you want to use the Wraithblades. If it is not your first turn, if you're going to score points in the next turn, so it's you went first. If you went first, you're going to want to move these guys on here so you can score primary objective points. And again, it's all about scoring primary. The best way to score primary is what you're going to use. And this is how I think the more competitive Ynnari armies will be built. I think they'll be built around this idea of MSU, objective control, and, stuff like that. I don't think the list I'm using is the most optimal list in the world. I think I have to play it more to really see what I need, what I don't need. Things like, for example, the Wraith Lords. Like, do I really need 3 of them? Are 2 enough for this list? Those kind of questions will be answered as I play more games. The Visarch and the 5 Incubi units, your Vrain and the 5 Incubi, do I really need those, or can I replace them with, an additional squad of Banshees? Like, can I have an additional squad of Banshees right here and an additional squad of Fire Dragons, right? Those are the kind of questions that you're going to be asking. And I actually think I would love to have these units, because later in the game, by the way, right, these Assault Intercessors come in, they're a little more expensive. They like to, stage for the next turn. They come in and kill something after you've scored points, and then now you can use your Banshees. Now you can use your Incubi to take these guys out because they are of greater value. These are Warp Talons, but they're kind of the same models, as far as their base sizes and stuff, so I use them as an example. All right, and that's about it. I hope you guys learned a little bit of something about how to kind of move the army around. A lot of it is going to depend on what your opponent does. But the good news is that we have a lot of reactive stuff that we can use depending on what our opponent does. And I hope I went through some of those examples with you guys of what your opponent might do and how to retain primary anyway. And that's going to be the goal. The goal of this list is no matter what your opponent does, you're going to be able to score primary either the next turn or this turn, right? Either by making objectives sticky, moving units onto objectives to out-OC your opponent, and stuff like that. There is a reason why we're using Corsair Void Reavers. A lot of people will think, oh, why not use Scorpions? Or why not use, another unit? Not only are they more expensive, but they don't have the OC. And in the early game, OC matters a lot more than you might think, because a lot of opponents are going to be using things that have 10 OC on the early game to capture these objectives because they're a little bit cheaper. They're a little bit sometimes more durable in certain armies, and they're going to be able to cap those objectives much easier, whereas a lot of your units just aren't going to be able to do that if you don't have the OC for it. So using Void Reavers is perfect. I love Void Reavers now. I personally think that if you're running Ynnari, you need at least a couple units of these guys. Maybe you don't need 3 units, but you definitely need 2. And I personally like 3 because that gives me the option to put a unit of these guys on any of the objectives that I choose. So no matter what my opponent goes after, no matter what my opponent has up their sleeves, I can put 10 OC on an objective after they kill a unit in shooting. Now, the only other thing that your opponent could do to kind of counter you is not shoot you. But if they're running an army like Marines, which is primarily a shooting army, or Chaos Space Marines, which is like a mix of combat and shooting, they're going to have a hard time getting the full value of their expensive units if they don't shoot you. So it's kind of like a win-win for you in most cases. There are some armies that are pure melee out there, and against those specific armies, your best tactic is to use these units of Corsairs to screen out the opponent, let them charge into your cheap chaff, and then hit them with a huge counterattack with units like Banshees, Incubi, Fire Dragons, Wraith Blades, stuff like that, and overwhelm your opponent if your opponent wants to try to Zerg you. It's not in their best interest to Zerg, because once they Zerg with most of their units, you have a lot of fights first in your army, and they're just not going to be able to outvalue you in general. So I think overall, this army is really strong against a lot of builds, even against melee builds, fast melee builds, which is supposed to be the counter to this list. I think if you just change your mindset, just tweak your mindset a little bit and play the list a little bit differently, then you will have a lot of success with it. Okay, that's going to be it for our example. Thanks for tuning into the Tabletop Simulator Showdown here, and we will be right back to the video in just a second. So, in conclusion, the Ynnari are a very hard army to beat on primary, and if built correctly, can even counter their primary weakness, which is fast-moving melee armies. A lot of people out there will tell you, how do you counter them? Fast-moving melee lists. But if the list is built correctly and run right, even fast-moving melee lists are going to have a little bit of trouble against you if they're not prepared. The army also requires precise list building, movement, and a deeper understanding of the primary missions to be successful. You really do have to kind of go through all the primary missions in the deck and kind of run through how your army would operate on the battlefield in each of those missions to be successful. And that can be a little bit tricky, And you definitely want to get your deployment zones down and your movement ranges and threat ranges down with this army as well, because if you don't, it's going to be very hard. And I think that's one of the reasons why Ynnari hasn't truly exploded yet. It's doing very well, but it hasn't truly exploded to most Eldari players because it is a very hard army to run. And it took me actually probably about 3 or 4 hours just on Tabletop Simulator, going through all the different deployments, deploying my army. How would I move in this situation? What would I do here? Can I get to this spot on turn one? What do I have to do to get to this spot turn one? And how do I manage my resources for that and stuff like that before I went into any of my games? Because I didn't want to go into my first game completely, just absolutely clueless like I did in my first 1,000-point game with this army, and a 1,000-point game that ended up lasting 3.5 hours. Mostly because I just didn't know the rules at the time, and it was a new codex, and this detachment was incredibly hard to figure out. But yeah, you do have to do your homework with this army. And it hard counters a lot of factions in the game if you're able to do that, and will most likely, unfortunately, because of that, be nerfed in 3 months' time. So the last thing I want to leave you guys on is, will this detachment be nerfed? Absolutely. At some point, that normal move is going to turn into a 7-inch move, and that's probably going to be the limit of the nerfs. I don't see any of the stratagems being nerfed. I don't think any of them are OP. I don't think anything except the first ability, which is Lethal Intent, the first detachment ability, will be nerfed. Everything else I think is fine. It's just that one thing. And I think once that gets nerfed, there's not a lot that's going to be done. I still think, though, even if it's nerfed, this is going to be an incredibly good army still. It just might not be as good in certain situations, right? Certain deployments might give this army a hard time with that nerf to 7 inches. And, not being able to use battle focus on the move might be kind of not so great as well on certain deployments. But in most situations, I think it's still going to be a strong detachment, which is good. That's a good place to be in general. So, yeah, if you guys are thinking of running Ynnari and are really excited for it, I will say this is the last kind of thing. I think there are 3 different ways to build Ynnari. It's not just this way that I've described. There's 3 different ways. I have basically created a more Wraith-oriented and MSU-oriented Ynnari build, but there's also Big Dick Ynnari, which is just shove big units of, very hard-hitting units down your opponent's throat with insane movement and just try to cripple them right away with kind of more of an measured alpha strike, a metered alpha strike. I think there's probably only one issue with this, and that is if you can't get the value out of that big unit, if your opponent doesn't give you the good targets that you need to, it can suffer. But there is, you could go with Big Dick Ynnari. That's a definite strategy. You could go with, kind of more of a shooting style Ynnari that has more shooting units that are going to rely more on those lethal hits and stuff like that in the backfield, and then, use your normal, MSU in the front to, control primary. I think that's another way to build it. And there's another way to build it yet where you just focus mostly on Wraith units. I know that seems very insane, but, maybe 2 Wraithblade units, maybe 3 Wraith Lords, the Incarn, very smash, kind of a smash Ynnari, I would say. And that I'm kind of in between an MSU and a smash list, and I think that's worked for me. But, there's a lot of different ways you can build the Ynnari up, and I think each one of them can be viable. It's just all going to be down to movement values, your positioning, and of course, the ability to build a list that operates in those 3 stages that I spoke of, which is the skirmishing stage, right? The primary control stage where you take control of the primary objectives, and then the last stage of the game is you lock your opponent out of the objectives. So if they try to out OC you on something, you just heroically intervene, kill them, be done with it, right? And if you're able to do that for the majority of the game, you will outscore your opponent each and every time, even though probably most of your list by the end of the game is going to be pretty ravaged. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last 2.5 years. Almost 3 years now, by the way, guys. Considering that, in the very beginning, my channel got deleted by some malware or some, hacker. But yeah, it's almost been 3 years since this has been going on. It's been an awesome journey, so thank you so much, guys, to everybody. And thank you so much to all of the people who interact with my videos and stuff like that. Even if you may not be a patron, thank you for interacting. really, honestly, is so helpful. If you do want to become a patron and join the Proxy Hammer community on Discord, I will leave a link in the description for that. You basically sign up for a free Patreon trial and you will get the link after that for free at no charge. I also have an Amazon affiliate link that I'll leave in the description if you want to buy some discounted Eldar minis. There are Fire Dragons, there are Warp Spiders online available now. There is the Combat Patrol available as well on Amazon, so check that out if you can, if you haven't gotten a chance to get some of the new units. And lastly, I do have a channel store page with Eldar inspired apparel if you want to check that out as well. All right, guys, that's going to be for today's video. Once again, thank you for watching and have a great one. See you later, guys. Peace out.